Why am I feeling guilt when I am in fact grieving? Well, Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, who was one of the earliest and most profound authors that spoke to the importance of doing grief work, wrote that guilt is perhaps the most painful companion to death. Today we're going to explore the role of guilt in grief. Grief so often invites in guilt. These are two intense personal emotions that we often, of course, naturally shy away from. But when they pair up together, when someone who we have loved has died, it creates the perfect storm. Today we're going to talk about the woulda, coulda, shouldas when someone who we love or care about has died. But I'm going to ask you to watch to the end where I'm able to offer up 3 tips that might be able to interrupt your guilt experience while you are grieving. Please join our Grievolution community by subscribing to this channel, and please turn on the notifications so that you'll know every time we're talking about a different nuance of grief, such as today when we're talking about the topic of guilt and grief. Hi, I'm McRogers, and I'm a therapist that specializes in supporting people in their grief. And I have to say that the topic of guilt comes up endlessly in the appointments with the people that I support. Grief and guilt seem to go hand in hand. I will have people tell me that they have experienced the loss of their great-great-great-grandparent who died in their own bed, in their own home, beside their partner with their dog, in their sleep. And well, personally, I start thinking that that's a lovely way to be able to leave this world. The person who is experiencing the grief personalizes that and finds ways to invite in guilt. It shows up in questions such as, if I had stayed on the phone longer, if I had counted the medications the last time I was there, if I had only gone to that last doctor's appointment, maybe I could have prevented this. Grief and guilt just seem to go hand in hand. The difficulty, however, is that the guilt often comes to us through the rearview mirror. It is thinking about the would've, could've, should'ves that we all do a natural inventory with when someone who we love has died. Guilt itself is such a sneaky emotion. Guilt may present itself when you are grieving because you feel responsible for the death of the loved one, because you feel like you should have been there for them more often in life, because you feel like you should have been there with them right at the exact moment of their death. It can show up because you regret something about your relationship with this person. These are really common thoughts that show up regardless of the circumstances of the death. The guilt is often irrational, but that doesn't change our experience of it. Whether you've lost a pet or experienced a miscarriage or lost a terminally ill grandparent, if you've needed to make excruciating decisions about someone's life and death, each situation can carry with it feelings of guilt. It's incredibly important to understand that this feeling is natural amongst all of us experiencing grief. It's so important to know that loss is not your fault. It is not your fault that they have died. It is not your fault how they died. There are far too many what-ifs and circumstances and logistics for any of those guilt-ridden feelings to actually have any real weight. It will often show up in statements or feelings such as, if I didn't say or do enough, did I make the right decision? Drawing conclusions about ourselves being a horrible person because of the guilt is very dangerous. Generally, there are 3 categories for the sources of guilt that we experience. One is, I have done something wrong. The likelihood of that is very slim. The second category is you feel you have done something wrong. This is a huge category where people feel tremendous weight and guilt. The third category is self-protection. Our brains are designed to protect us. And so when we're feeling out of control, we look for control. So if we can actually figure out what we did wrong, then we're able to prevent doing it again next time and feeling this pain. It's a natural occurrence that our brains try to protect ourselves from pain. Has guilt played a role in your grief? If this is true for you, please just put a simple yes in the comments so that together we can learn and observe how common this experience is, and know that it is far more likely to be an element of grieving than the fact that we have actually done anything to be guilty about. So here are my 3 tips that are going to talk about how to address the guilt in your grief. Tip number 1 talks about the fact that I want you to acknowledge that guilt is a normal grief emotion. I want you to consider what your guilt is all about. Is it rational? Is your guilt irrational? Is it about control? Grief teaches us that we have no control. So naturally we look for control. If your guilt feelings are irrational, then I want you to admit that to yourself. Do an accountability or an inventory of rational versus irrational guilt. I call this the wine and bag of chips pathway. You start off with small amounts of wine and chips, and before you know it, the bag of chips and the bottle of wine are both empty. It becomes a grief intoxication. Grief and guilt leave us down that rabbit hole. This acknowledgement that guilt is part of grief isn't meant to be a dismissing of your feelings of guilt, but it is a means of acknowledging that though you feel guilty, you may not actually be guilty. Some common examples of acknowledging this are statements such as knowing that you did the best you could at the time with the information that you had, knowing that you couldn't predict the future, knowing that there were so many other factors at play than just your behavior or your decisions. These are also important in accepting that grief invites in guilt, which is often irrational. Acknowledging that can be so helpful in our grief work. The second tip that I wish to share with you today is to write the letter. Write the never to be seen, never to be shared, never to be sent letter. Imagine that you get yourself into a space to truly focus on thinking about the person that you have loved and lost. Imagine telling them how you feel. Tell them of your love for them. Tell them of your regrets. Tell them of your guilt. Put it all on paper. If there are things you wish you had said to them, write it out. Go for as long as you need. And then I want you to turn those pages over, start on a fresh piece of paper, and I want you to put yourself in their mindset. And I want you to then imagine what your loved one might write back to you. What would they tell you? Write the letter back from their point of view. Know that it will be filled with compassion and love. It's an interesting way to try to meet any guilt or regrets that you hold. If you find that this is successful for you, please, again, write a comment below about how this tip served you. The third tip is to challenge your judgy, self-judgy, guilty thoughts with an antidote. What I want you to do again is pen to paper, make a list of all the things that you can account for that you did do well. These moments that we feel guilt or regret, they are small parts of a very big picture. Making the list of all the things you did well may capture broader and far more important aspects of both the relationship and the death of the person you cared about. These moments are there, but you will need to seek them out and cultivate an awareness of them. They can show up in things such as loving them beyond their faults, loving them beyond their illness or the changes that they experienced, loving them beyond their death. It can show up in asking questions and advocating for them. It can show up in accepting them to die on their own terms, even if it's not what you want. It can show up in terms of pleading with them to please stay longer because you're not yet ready to say goodbye. It can show up in hand-holding. It can show up in filling the room with your best emotions in spite of being so scared of losing them. There are so many ways that your love has shown up for them. I want you to make an inventory so that you can hold yourself accountable to all of the things that you did do well. Be kind to yourself when you're talking about grief and guilt. So just as a quick summary, If guilt has followed you into your grief, know that this is a normal, natural grieving emotion. And please accept that it is probably an irrational emotion at this point. Second tip is to write the letter. Write the letter of everything you need to say, maybe didn't have the chance to say, all of the wisdom you gather out of the rearview mirror. It's not too late. Write the letter. Turn the pages over, and then write the letter back from the loved one or the cared one, from their perspective of love, kindness, and compassion back to you. And then the third thing to do is please make the inventory. There are probably many, many things you have done well, many, many things you have done to support the person you've loved and lost, and things that you've done to support yourself as well. Use that as an antidote to all of those guilty feelings. So if this video has proven helpful at all, please like it with the thumbs up down below. That way more people will be able to see it and know that they need to process their guilt with their grief. Consider subscribing, consider sharing the channel with anybody who might benefit from doing some grief work. And know that if guilt has followed you into your grief work, it's normal and natural. And part of the antidote to that is always kind thoughts, kind words, and a kind heart. So thank you, and I look forward to seeing you next time.